we are being joined by an aquatic ecosystems expert on a webinar who's going to be talking about the restoration of a river ecosystem. The river in question, of course, is the Cauvery, which many of us know is a river system in distress to the point that it is at the center of a long-running water-sharing dispute between two neighboring states. And it is this very river where Neethi, our speaker, started out by studying the Humpback Mahseer, a critically endangered species of fish. Um, I believe when Neethi started out, the species used to be just endangered, which is a level better than being critically endangered that it is now. But unfortunately, that's the state that we are in. But back to Neethi's story. So the Mahseer is a migratory fish, and Neethi, as part of her studies, would radio tag them and follow them wherever they went. And this eventually led Neethi to the origins of the Cauvery in the Western Ghats, in Coorg to be specific. But the Western Ghats, we know, are also the source of many other southern perennial rivers. So they are a very important ecosystem. Once in the Western Ghats, Neethi observed how rapidly the river ecosystems were changing for a whole host of factors. And this is exactly what set her to go down on this path of habitat conservation and restoration, the story of which is best narrated by Neethi herself. Before I hand it over to Neethi, though, a little bit more about her. So Neethi Mahesh is a river ecologist and also a conservationist and a nature educator. And in her own words, Neethi was perhaps amongst the first batch of students in her school to study environmental science, EVS, as part of which she was part of field projects to monitor freshwater ecosystems on her campus. So she was already doing this stuff as a child and I guess was destined to fall in love with rivers. And then she then went on to study freshwater ecosystems in the Agumbe rainforest, where she mapped one of the tributaries of the Sita Nadi. Agumbe is also where Neethi's work on Mahseer conservation started, which eventually led to the restoration and conservation work that she is now known for. In addition to this, Neethi also runs a river monitoring initiative to build support for river conservation and draws hope from working with children and engaging with communities. So with this, Neethi, I'd like to invite you to share your amazing story of river restoration with us.
Thank you so much, Mandeep, and I want to thank the Ecological Restoration Alliance for providing this platform to share my work. I'll jump straight into the presentation. So this is what a riparian gallery forest looks like in Coorg district. That's the Dubare Reserve Forest that you see there. So that's the habitat that we're going to be talking about today, primarily. I'm just going to share an introductory visual on riparian ecosystems. There's actually no narration with this video, so it's just visuals and text mostly. So to start the presentation, I'm going to go straight into our study area, which is Coorg or Kodagu, as it's known. It's situated in Karnataka, of course. It's part of the central western Ghats landscape. The district covers about 4,102 square kilometers of area. It's the catchment area of the Cauvery, Lakshman-Tita, and Harangi. Harangi and Lakshman-Tita, of course, are tributaries of the Cauvery. So just looking at some of the land use, land change maps over from 1973 all the way to 2018, this is a study done by the Indian Institute of Science. It shows us that there's been a drastic decline in forest cover spanning those decades. So the region had 32% forest cover area in 1973, whereas now, and not now, but back in 2018, it shows only 19% forest cover under protected areas. So there's been a drastic reduction in protected area cover, mainly due to expansion and plantations, and also more recently, development projects and also real estate, expansion of real estate projects. So just to kind of give you an idea of what the landscape is like, you have the Shola grasslands. That's where the source of the Cauvery also originates from. You have the Shola grasslands, which then transitions into the evergreen forests, where you also have sacred groves all along the district. And you have evergreen forests, you have paddy wetland ecosystems, you have the coffee agroforest ecosystem, which transitions into moist deciduous, and then also the dry deciduous as it exits the district. So just to go into protected areas, in terms of community protected areas, you have Devakads in Coorg district. It's home to the indigenous Kuruba tribe, and they've had Devakads since time immemorial. There's more than 100 deities that they worship, and um, every year they make a visit to one of these Devakads to kind of celebrate the forest and their way of life. Most of them, of course, are nature worshippers. They're also ancestral worshippers, and they all respect laws that are pertinent to these protected areas. But there's also been a change in the area of protected areas over a period of time. There were originally 873 Devakads pre-independence time, and now the number has increased to 1,214 Devakads, and this is mainly due to fragmentation within the landscape. And this fragmentation is due to encroachment of course, agroforest zones into the Devakad areas. And it's become very evident now. And then in some places, you will even see real estate projects coming up where it says Devakads. There are many biodiversity hotspots, and it also provides extremely important and vital hydrological ecosystem services. So this is what a Devakad looks like. This is a very mini and small Devakad found in a place called Hudikeri, which is in South Coorg. Devakads also provide protection to fish, freshwater fish, like the Wayanad Mahseer. Now you find three different species of Mahseer in the Cauvery. You find the Wayanad Mahseer in hill stream ecosystems, And then you have blue-finned Mahseer and the critically endangered Humpback Mahseer. So there's two, in Karnataka, there are about 21 or 22 fish sanctuaries recognized by the Fisheries Department. So this is under the provision of their Conservation and Development Act, where they can declare stretches of rivers as fish sanctuaries. So this is where you find two sanctuaries in hill stream areas where they protect Wayanad Mahseer, and two sanctuaries downstream in the Cauvery where there's protection for bluefin Mahseer and humpback Mahseer. So just getting to where one can actually find Mahseer or study Mahseer. So this was a tricky question because I actually came across Mahseer in the Sita Nadi. That was the first time I ever saw Mahseer. And there were large shoals of them, in fact, feeding under riparian trees. The first instance of when I came across that, or that interaction between the riparian corridor and two different species, such as the Malabar giant squirrel and the bluefin Mahseer, was along the riparian corridor, where the giant squirrel was eating fruits and dropping bits of fruit into the water, and the Mahseer were all shoaling in and racing towards the water to get as much as they could from whatever was falling from the tree. So basically, that's where that interaction happened, and that's where it started. And then I started looking into where we could study it. Sita Nadi, unfortunately, even though it comes under the protected area, is not protected in terms of its river habitat. There's a lot of dynamiting that happens and gill netting that happens that pose a threat to the Mahseer population in the river. Not just the Mahseer population, but the freshwater fish population in the river as a whole. So, and that's basically how I started looking into where one could actually carry out a long-term study on Mahseer species. So you also have informal protected areas, and these are basically managed by communities and also under the lease of the Karnataka Fisheries Department, where the Fisheries Department has recognized people who've been doing this for over 40 years or so and given them a lease under their jurisdiction. And then you also have temple sanctuaries and sacred groves. But with temple sanctuaries and sacred groves, what happens is there are no guidelines specifically to kind of determine the area required for conservation in terms of protection. So this could span anywhere between 50 meters to 100 meters. So I didn't think that was enough area to study fish, especially with temple sanctuaries and sacred groves. So that's what actually brought me to Coorg district, where there's community-based river conservation happening for over 4 decades. So the Coorg Wildlife Society was set up in 1985. They are known largely for all of their conservation work in the district. They're one of the oldest organizations in Coorg. And strangely and funnily, nobody really recognized the Cauvery as a river that needed protection back then. It was the community or the family that lived there. They're called the Chandanda family that live in Valnur village. And they're the ones who started talking about Mahseer, and they took a Mahseer specimen all the way to Madikeri from Valnur, and that's about 30 kilometers or so, just to show them that these big fish exist. And when I say big fish, I'm referring to the Humpback Mahseer, which has now been declared as critically endangered. So that's how it all started. So it started back 40 years ago when this fish was taken to Madikeri office, and that's when they realized that they needed to protect the stretch. And ever since then, they've been working with the fisheries department and been working with the local communities to ensure that there's only subsistence fishing happening. And of course, they also give out angling licenses to people who can do catch and release angling. And through that, we know the status of the Humpback Mahseer from the period that the organization started conservation work along the Cauvery. So this is also patrolled by river watchers and a network of informers. Even till date, you get news of like people trying to poach fish from the stretch of the river. So they're constantly active and constantly monitoring the stretch of the river. So that's the reason I basically chose Coorg as my study area to carry out a spatial ecology study on Mahseer. And to do this, I basically chose telemetry as a tool to study them because one is you can monitor their movement all throughout. So just to look at what their habitat requirement is as a species, what their migratory patterns are, since they're known to be migratory. And there are many anecdotal stories about how they've known to move hundreds of kilometers, but there's no data for it. And also their dispersal, when they disperse, and their response to seasonal flows, and foraging and feeding behavior, like the one that I had observed in Sita Nadi, and the reproductive sites. So these were some of the questions that came up when we started the telemetry study. So the telemetry study was carried out in collaboration with Carleton University, where we had Dr. Shannon Bauer, who came down, and we tagged about 34 bluefin Mahseer. I'll tell you why bluefin Mahseer, because we did spend a lot of time fishing. This was back in 2015, and the only fish we caught, fortunately or unfortunately, back then were bluefin Mahseer. So it just goes to tell you that the population of bluefin Mahseer had increased, and the population of the critically endangered humpback Mahseer had decreased. And we use external mount tags to tag the fish. And these are all, of course, with a frequency of 145 to 150. And the fish were also given names, just because we decided, yes, they should have names too. Why not, you know? And we tracked them over a period of 1 year. So this was the pre-monsoon distribution of the fish. This is along a 3 kilometer stretch. It's actually not that long a stretch. It's along 3 kilometers where we focused on just catching and tagging and releasing the fish. So this is what it looked like. So this here, of course, you have a mix of habitats. You have deep pools, extremely deep pools, contiguous deep pools, and you have rapids. The dry sandy air patch that you see there are actually rapids. And then, of course, you have deep contiguous pools again. This is one stretch on the Cauvery where you have contiguous deep pools. So it's also probably one of the reasons why there's a large population of fish that are still present in this area, of course, given that there's also protection for them. And post monsoon, we ended up losing quite a fish. We did search for about 45 kilometers or more, and we couldn't find the rest of them. But what tends to happen is there's also a lot of people who catch fish. There's no way of discerning how the fish went missing because you can't really see them. So that's one of the challenges we had during the study. But of course, you also had a resident population that stayed back. So this whole hypothesis about how fish, all of the fish migrate during the monsoon, kind of, it kind of changed our perspective because there were still some fish that remained in some of these deep pools, and some of these fish were the larger fish and not the small fish. So going into what the outcomes are and what we expect from the study, of course, was the ecological requirements. We also did some water quality testing during the study. We riparian management plans and data to supplement to the fisheries department just for the demarcation of fish sanctuaries, because as I mentioned earlier, there are no clear guidelines for this, and it could be anywhere from 50 to 100 meters, but we don't know the exact amount of area required to protect migratory fish like Mahseer. And of course, data to supplement to EIAs in terms of dams, because I think in the Himalayas, in the EIAs, several EIAs state that Mahseer only require 50 centimeters of water to survive. So we thought, why not also collect data and kind of provide recommendations based on what we learned from the telemetry study. And the study in Coorg came to an end after 2 years, but we decided to continue it because we felt like it wasn't a large enough sample size to determine anything or provide any recommendations as such. We decided to continue the study in collaboration with the Wildlife Association of South India, who also have a similar model, catch and release angling model, where they protected 40 kilometers of the stretch back in the day, back in the 70s, before the fishing ban came into place in Cauvery Wildlife Sanctuary. So you find a sizable population of humpback Mahseer in the Cauvery Wildlife Sanctuary, Coorg Wildlife Society stretch, of course, and some parts of Kabini. So these are the three last strongholds of Mahseer populations in Karnataka. And now coming to the habitat assessment, as part of the management plan, we also wanted to look at the habitat requirement of Mahseer and specifically the riparian habitat. So I did a survey of the riparian habitat in a protected area. So 14 kilometers of the river has the Dubare Reserve Forest and the Maldare Forest on one side, and the other side of the river has your coffee agroforest zone. So it only made sense to do the survey in the protected area because the riparian zone there has been fairly intact for hundreds of years. There's not much disturbance in the riparian corridor as such. So all of our baseline information was collected in the Dubare area. So we did 100-meter transects looking at species richness, species diversity, and worked with the Jenu Kuruba tribe specifically. So collected all of the names in the local language. Also looked at phenology. So the study was carried out over a period of 2 years. So that gave us time to look at the phenology as well, looking at fruiting, flowering times. And there are some species that actually fruit during the monsoon, species of Zyzygene. So it was interesting to come across such information. So we use that as part of our restoration guidelines um, moving forward. So this is briefly what the riparian corridor looks like with these species. These are the primary species. So you have Mandifera indica, you have Calophyllum species, you have Salix tetrasperma, you have Maduka nidifolia, Vitex leucoxylon, Zyzygenium haenianum, that's the one that fruits during the monsoon. Law's gooseberry, Hopia parviflora, which is quite abundant in the stretch. Even though it's an evergreen species, you find it here in the moist deciduous moist deciduous stretch of the river. And of course, river crinum lilies, Pongamia pinnata, which has established itself over time. It was actually introduced and now it's quite abundant in the riparian zone. And you also have Shodia roxburghi and Diospyro species all along the riparian corridor. So we basically took these species and I started working with the Jenu Kuruba tribe. So we host our nursery with the tribe in their household because all of them have been given land by the forest department by the river. They're also part of the Dubare elephant camp. So they are permanent residents in this particular stretch of the forest and the river. And it only made sense to start the nursery there because it would just be easier to sustainably source the seedlings and saplings as well because they go into the forest every day. So we worked with the forest department to do this. We got permission from them and we set up our nursery. It was very small scale and we used to hand out saplings for free initially. And we still do hand out saplings for free. But this is a model that we started and it's something that we're looking at working on more and changing as we move forward. So just to give you a brief idea of what's happening along the river. I spoke about land use cover as a whole in the district. Now we're just going to zoom in on the river stretch. So we looked at a 5 kilometer square radius along the river. This spans about 40 kilometers or so. And this was what it looked like in 1998. And in 2018, as you can see, like just going back here, you have deciduous forest, urban settlements, agriculture, grassland, evergreen forest, and plantation area. And you can see that the plantation area has gone up in 2018. And this also kind of is an indicator of what's happening to the river. So I don't know if you can see the right-hand side of the screen where it shows you the area
We can
or the
see it,
change.
Neethi. We can see it on 2018 and
Yeah, 1998 and
yeah,
2018.
we can see that column.
Yeah, as you can see, the agricultural area has gone up, deciduous forest is reduced, evergreen forest area is reduced, grasslands have reduced. Grasslands, when I say grasslands, I also mean wetlands. So there's been a conversion of paddy wetlands as well. Plantation area has gone up almost double, and settlement has also gone up. There's rapid expansion of um, all the towns in Coorg district at the moment. And the water in 2018, which I would say was also kind of a drought year, but there's also a reduction in flow of water. And now, as we've seen over the years, there's a lot of irrigation that happens during summertime as well. So this data was collected up to summer. So there's a lot of irrigation that happens directly from the river during summer. So there's a lot of water being drawn out from the river during summer as well. So there's been a reduction in flow of water, mainly due to one, climate change, and two, land use, and three, over extraction. I wouldn't say over extraction, but just extraction to sustain the coffee agrosystem. And what happened? So the same year, during the monsoon, things changed drastically again. It's the first time we ever experienced high intensity rainfall events. Like nobody had ever experienced this in the last 40 decades or so. So even if you speak to some of the elders in Coorg, they say maybe in the 70s they had one high intensity rainfall event, but after that they haven't seen anything. So we received about 800 millimeters of rainfall in 1 week. And in 2019, it repeated itself. I don't know if you all remember, but there were a lot of landslides and there was a lot of flooding. And this was a huge red flag for Coorg, starting from that point, from that point onwards. So that kind of marks a clear break in a transition of weather patterns for Coorg district. And yeah, 2019, we got 1,000 millimeters of rainfall in 1 week, whereas the average rainfall in Coorg district alone is 2,500 to 3,500 millimeters. So what did we do? So following this, of course, there's a lot of destruction along the riparian corridors, and also there's a lot of settlements along the river that got affected. These are mainly settlements that have moved all the way up to the riparian corridor. And of course, coffee estates that have moved all the way up to the riparian corridor, not giving them that buffer zone to kind of brace against the flooding. And these are it's been a high velocity flooding event, mainly because it's upstream near the source. So the destruction is way more compared to if you were further downstream. So we got together again with our nursery work and we had some saplings ready already. Until then, of course, it was slow on the uptake. When we were talking about conserving riparian habitats, it was mainly for the ecological aspect of it. But this is when, this is when flooding came into the picture and we started receiving more support to do the kind of work that we'd set out to do, mainly because of the flooding and to kind of build climate resilience. People started identifying the need that you need to start planting native trees along the river. And so they started reaching out to us. So we started working with the forest department. We started working with schools and we also started working with the planter community and we started handing out saplings. And this, of course, was based mainly on the restoration guide that was drafted for the specific stretch that tells you how the planting needs to be done. So you have the upper section and you have a middle section and you have a lower section of species that that are basically planted along the profile of the river. So there were some people who came up and said, you know what, why don't we just cut down some of these trees and then build an embankment instead? And this has been done in some places, actually, just downstream from here, and that impacted communities even worse because this again increases the velocity of floods. And not just that, you're taking away habitat of lots of birds and fish and otters and a lot of other flora, fauna. So this is one of the things that was supposed to be implemented along the river, and luckily it was stopped by the local community. And this is what happened to that particular zone where they excavated to kind of lay down the embankment. So when we had the floods in 2019, the water started coming all the way in. And you can see the clear demarcation there. You have the riparian zone, you have the agroforest zone, and you can see how far in the water comes if there is no corridor present along the riverbank. And then that led to us working in collaboration with a lot of stakeholders. So the Forestry College have been really instrumental in lending us their support. And by spreading the word and talking to the planters and the rest of the community to say that, look, this needs to be done. And it has to be done scientifically. We can't just go and plant any species we feel like, which tends to happen. There have been Terminalia Arjuna that have been brought into the district, and it's not part of that moist deciduous stretch. As per some of our surveys, you don't find Terminalia Arjuna at all. It's a keystone species for the Cauvery. You can find them widely all along the Cauvery Wildlife Sanctuary, but not in Coorg district. So some of these conversations started happening, conversations and discussions, because there were a lot of species being brought in simply because they're known, they're popular, and they're also fast-growing species, but they don't necessarily provide the same ecosystem services. So we had a lot of these discussions with the forest department, and we drafted guidelines with the forest department where they set aside their compensatory afforestation funding for restoration work as well. So we focused a lot of our work on just building up the nursery to a larger scale, because all along it was just us and two small households that were managing the nursery work. But the department decided to step in after a while, and we put in effort for a year. But of course, the Campa funds for just about a year or so. So that ran dry. And after that, it got discontinued. And of course, we have Coorg Wildlife Society. They are actively protecting that stretch, as I mentioned earlier. They also have collaborations with all of the communities that live there. So it's a good partnership to be working with them, just to kind of reach out to a larger audience, let's say, get them involved in the restoration work. Otherwise, it could be quite daunting just to reach out to every community that lives along the river. So we're thinking of covering a stretch of 30 kilometers or so to do the restoration work. And of course, these plots are, I don't have the slides here, but these plots are not large plots per se, because you already have existing vegetation there. You have a lot of invasive species, you have introduced species, you have commercial species. So it's about finding that balance and finding that mix, and also places where there's been landslides along the river after the floods. So to come up with restoration measures for that, for instance, reinforcement for those banks where there's been landslides, to kind of hold the soil stable and ensure that it doesn't run off. And of course, planting in different phases. So you have planting pre-monsoon to see how many survive before during the monsoon, and planting post-monsoon. Now, what happens in the forest zone is that your riparian corridor is intact, and they already have a root system where all of the seedlings and saplings have protection from the root systems and the mother trees to survive the flood. But that's not something you find on the agroforest zone. It's more or less bare, other than the invasive species and the commercial species. So restoration will take a long time, and we're still on the journey of learning and doing more research with restoration plots. So we've entered into a MOU with the Forestry College to do long-term monitoring of restoration plots, which we will probably start in 2026. That's soon, that's next year. But yeah, so that's as far as the restoration work in Coorg is concerned. This is to bring you up to speed. That's what's happening presently. We had the nursery. The nursery work has been stalled, but we're getting back to it in 2026, and hopefully with more support, not just financially, but even institutional support. Most of this work has been done mainly through our NGO, which is called Foundation for Rivers and Ecosystems. And it's mostly just me as an individual working with the Jenu Kuruba tribe. But it would be nice to have institutions or organizations on board to kind of make this more robust and make it matter at the end of the day. It does, I mean, it does matter, but it would just be nicer to have more people on board. And as part of our outreach, started working with schools along the river. So there are 10 government schools that you find all the way from Bagamanla, which is near the source of the Cauvery, to the river exits, Coorg district. There's a place called Kudumangaluru. So we worked with them over 3 consecutive summers, and we did water quality monitoring along with other interactive sessions, just about their knowledge of flora and fauna, and what their relationship is with the river, because most of these children all live very close to the river. So we came up with a model that kind of worked, and it could be replicated with all the other schools. And the teachers were also very receptive towards this, and they felt like it was relevant. So we distributed water testing kits to each of the schools, and it's something that we need to continue with them. But because of this, because of the work that we did over 3 years, and we realized that there was no space to really showcase this or set up like a monitoring network, we decided to launch a digital platform called Our River, Our Life. Now, this is basically all of the activities that we did with schools. It's just there as an app and also a website app where you can document the activity. And this is how you go about collecting that information. So you have water level and weather, and then you just, when you're interacting with people, you're looking at the water level, you're like looking at water level and to check whether it's low, normal, high, or flooded, and the weather conditions on that day, and a picture of the river. And of course, geographical coordinates, which it picks up automatically. Most areas have cell phone network coverage here, so that's not an issue. But other than that, there's also activities like what's happening around the river. This is something that was really interesting because in places where we found high levels of nitrate and nitrite, we were able to connect it with the land use around there. So that's an interesting observation that was made during the water quality monitoring sessions specifically, because then you can connect that, there's so much nutrient input going into land that's again coming back to the river. So these are some of the observations that came up during then. And of course, we have other parameters as well, like hardness, dissolved oxygen, coliform bacteria, and documentation of flora and fauna, if possible, wherever it was possible. There was even a crocodile that came up during one of the sessions. All the children got really excited. We were watching the crocodile for about half an hour, and this crocodile ended up going about, let's say, about 5 meters next to a lady who was washing her clothes, and it was just there. It was just resting there. And we didn't, of course, alert the lady or anything, but this is how it is in the river, right? Everyone knows that the crocodiles exist. Everyone knows the crocodiles are there, but people know that the crocodiles also don't mean harm. So it's a nice, it's a nice touching point on just coexistence with the fauna that's there. So, and then of course, group pictures. So these are the different tools that we have on the platform. This river monitoring, flora and fauna, flood watch. Created flood watch only because the flooding event started, and I felt like, this is something that can go up as a long-term monitoring exercise, just to see which areas are getting flooded more and um, what kind of intervention is required for that specific stretch. So the tool Flood Watch is also part of our outreach and documentation of flora and fauna more specifically, simply because I feel like this is something that can be done by citizens, especially even if you don't know the scientific name, even if it's the local name, you can upload pictures and upload pictures with the local name, which we can get verified later by a plant taxonomist. Extremely important because simply because riparian corridors are not well documented all across the Western Ghats. In the Cauvery, now it's done. I mean, Cauvery survey was done also by Bangalore University, and more specifically, like more location-specific work was done by us, and places like Goa. So we decided to also take this forward and move into Goa. Worked with a researcher called Valsina who wanted to work on the Dudhsagar landscape simply because it's least studied, and it's also the main source of water, drinking water for the city of Panjim. But there's a lot of land use change happening around there, and it's also a heavily impacted area in terms of mining. So there's a lot of mining that's happening along this river. So we decided to take this up as a case study again to do riparian corridor assessments and also to work with the community. So this was done in collaboration with Valsina, who's from Goa University, and also in collaboration with Bookworm Trust. Now, Bookworm Trust has a project called the Goa River Draw Project, where they worked on the Mandovi River. They worked with their network of libraries situated close to the river in mapping and documenting their river. So it only made sense to collaborate with them and make it more specific and focused towards riparian flora and just documenting riparian flora with the communities. So that turned into a really interesting activity because then we had zines and herbariums that were created I mean, we collected it, and this was all done by the libraries in each of these villages all along the Dudhsagar River and the Mandovi River. So yeah, so in terms of replicating what happened in Coorg as a project in Goa, so far has been successful. So we finished our riparian habitat assessment last year, and we're yet to publish our report. And the Goa Forest Department are also really supportive of the work, and they're looking forward to starting restoration work here, simply because, again, it's a mining affected area and it does require a lot of restoration work and effort. So slowly and steadily, we're moving forward one river to another, but there's still a lot of work to be done with the Kaveri River itself, maybe 5 or 10 years. Yeah. So the way forward is to create location-specific restoration guidelines for each of these rivers, and depending on the habitat type, whether it's evergreen or moist deciduous or deciduous forest, these things tend to get mixed up when we're working on restoration. So with rivers, it's very specific, simply because there's so many species that are adapted to the vegetation there and the fruiting and flowering cycles in these specific river systems. And for Coorg specifically, I think what I was looking at starting was a joint forest management initiative, just to keep the work going and to kind of provide them with a livelihood that supports the conservation of native species. There's a huge change in mindsets that's happening even with the Jenu Kuruba tribe in Coorg, simply because um, a lot of them work on estates during coffee picking season, and now also want to manage coffee and silver oak on the piece of land given to them by the forest department. So we were thinking, why not instead encourage them to grow native species, riparian species, and other forest species, and support them on a long-term, as a long-term plan, management plan. And of course, stakeholder-led restoration and monitoring efforts. And when I say stakeholder, I'm referring to institutions, the government, and the local community here. So it's mostly the agro forest coffee growing community. This work was also presented as a case study for the Cauvery rejuvenation project, which we never heard about later. They were supposed to release a budget just for restoration work for the Cauvery, but no one's spoken about it since then. And the hope is to kind of take the citizen science and river monitoring work far and wide. We launched a long time ago, but I don't think we've been very great in terms of outreach and just getting people to get engaged in these sort of activities across our restricted study sites and areas. So yeah, it's something that we want to open up to anyone and everyone who's interested, because it is an easy format of collecting data. And it is relevant data. And yeah, and coming to the end, a lot of people that were involved in this, all the forest department, Karnataka Forest Department, Goa Forest Department, the Fisheries Department, NGOs like Coorg Wildlife Society, Wildlife Association of South India, all the government schools. Yeah, I think, yeah, that's about it.
Thanks a lot, Neethi. Thank you for laying out all that it takes to protect and conserve a stretch of the river, and thank you for the work that you've done. It's quite interesting to see how you've managed to integrate the knowledge of the Jenu Kuruba community and build bridges with them. And also from our conversations before, I know that it's probably not always easy to work with different interests and running a small organization at the same time. So it's great to see how you've managed all these collaborations all these years. Also, actually,
Thank you.
very quite interesting that you gave names to the fish. I am actually quite curious about how one certain fish was called Old Monk. But if we had more time, I would have asked you what the story behind that is. But we'll save our time for more academic questions, and we have some already. Uh,
No, that's very simple. People in Coorg love their alcohol, so it just made sense. Like every angler that caught a fish got to name the fish. So that's how that system worked. The naming system worked based on the angler and the fish. Yeah.
I see you didn't find Old Monk again. Probably lost its way. Was too
Yeah.
inebriated. Before we move on to questions, I have a request for all of our attendees. I see that there are some questions dropped in the chat, and it's just easier for us to track them if you drop them in the question and answer tab. It's right there, right down there with the chats button. If I may request you to drop your questions in the question answer panel, it'll just be easier for us. And moving on to the questions, we'll go in chronological order. So the first one is from Shreya, who's asking whether there's any research paper written on this particular study or project.
We have a restoration guide that's only been distributed, let's say, within the forest department and the local community. That's something that can be shared as a tool.
All right, thanks.
Sure.
Actually, on that note, I'm reminded, I also found a booklet that you had published, Riparian Flora of the Cauvery. And if you're okay with that, we can also put that up as a resource on the ERA website. That's something that we can discuss later. So yeah, thanks, Shreya, for that question. M. Ramaswamy is asking, she's saying that the app is not available on the link, and he's asking for the link.
It should be up and running soon again. The thing is, we stopped work for the past 1 year, so everything's starting again in 2026.
Understood. I think someone else had asked in the chat if the app is only meant for the Kaveri ecosystem.
It's for all the rivers and freshwater ecosystems in India.
Understood. Thanks for that, Neethi. Moving on, we have a question from Siddhant, who's asking, where can we read past reports and be updated with your ongoing work?
Ongoing work mainly through, I guess, this platform, Our River, Our Life, which we will kickstart soon. But otherwise, I think you would have to email us directly to find out what's happening. Yeah.
We can, if it's okay with you, we can email with the attendees later.
Sure.
Anybody who wants to read the reports and get more data can get in touch with you directly. Madhura says, lovely presentation, Neethi. Thanks a lot. And so happy to see your Goa work also mentioned here. She's asking if the program is going to continue in Goa in any way.
We are trying to make it happen. We're applying for funding as we speak. Yeah. We're trying to continue it because we've finished a large chunk of the work in Goa. So it's all about just implementation now, starting the nursery work, nursery care, and tying it up with the restoration work. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that. Thanks, Madhura. We certainly hope you get the funding that you need to take your work to other places. Moving on, we have Samrat writing to us saying, hello, Neethi. This is Samrat from the Wildlife Trust of India, Sundarbans. First of all, he thanks you for the wonderful talk. And then his question is, what are the indicative measures to access the restoration of riparian zones, as well as how much time period data you're planning to do assess the restoration work in your study area?
I think it would take anywhere between 5 to 10 years to be able to say whether it's very, most of these species are slow growing species. So that's still something. Again, here we're looking for inputs and any suggestions from the restoration community because all of this is new. We're trying it for the first time, especially with riparian zones because you have flooding that affects the growth and mortality of the species. So it is going to take some time to be able to establish anything.
As is the case with restoration projects everywhere, needs time. On that note, actually, I was very surprised to hear that Terminalia Arjuna is not a species that's normally found in. I mean, I was wrong clearly, but I thought that it's a species that's commonly found along all riverbanks.
Yeah, strangely not in Coorg, especially the evergreen and moist deciduous stretch. You don't find it. Uh, maybe towards the tail end of the river when as it exits Coorg, where it becomes dry deciduous, where transitions into the dry deciduous zone. There you find some, but not in the upper reaches. Yeah.
Understood.
Here it's mostly Hopia parviflora and wild mango. These are the emergent species. And then Maduka nerifolia, which is your mid-story species. And lower section, you have Zyzidium henianum, which is really important. So yeah, there are 4 or 5 key species for the stretch.
Thanks,
And when I
Neethi.
say and when I say the stretch, it's about 30 kilometers or so. So it's quite a long stretch.
In the Dubare Wildlife Sanctuary, you mean?
Dubare Wildlife Sanctuary, Dubare Reserve Forest is only 14 kilometers of the river stretch in Coorg. But if we're talking about restoration work, it's mostly in the agroforest zone. The forest zone doesn't require any restoration work.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's where we sustainably collect all of our seedlings, saplings from. We also ensure we do that and not just collect it from one specific area. So we we spread out and collect it from different. Yeah.
Thanks for mentioning that. That's actually, I think, a very important conversation that our community needs to have more often. But yeah, moving on. Sachin asks, the next question is from Sachin, and he's asking uh, about the role of sacred groves in groundwater recharge and stream protection.
They play a very important role in groundwater recharge because one, they're relic forests. So all of the estates and wetlands that you see around there are basically replenished because of this ecosystem that's next to them. So they play a very important role in recharging your groundwater and aquifers. There
Mm.
has been a reduction, as you also, not a reduction in, the number of Devakads, it's very sad to say this, the number of Devakads have increased, but that doesn't mean the area of Devakads have increased. It's just that they're all fragmented into smaller bits now. Yeah. And like I said, one place you even have a real estate board that there is some apartment community or sorry, not villa community that's come up there. So, yeah.
Tragic. Yeah, but anyway, thank you. Thanks for that. Um, Moving on, Shreya has a follow-up question, and she's asking if the shift from endangered to critically endangered is due to anthropogenic factors, and what is the role of indigenous communities in this aspect. I believe, Shreya, you're asking about the Mahseer, and please feel free to come online and clarify if needed.
Yes, I was talking about Mahseer.
Okay, so how that's impacted, how humans have impacted their populations, is that the
Yes.
question on? Well, as with any other stretch, as I mentioned earlier, like there's very few protected stretches, and this is one area where they're well protected, but anywhere outside of that, you see a decline in fish populations. Like there's hardly any Mahseer, um, lower diversity of fish species, and a lot of invasives. So wherever there's no Mahseer, you actually see a lot of invasive species of fish, like tilapia and African catfish. So this is what's happening in the Cauvery at present. And of course, bluefin Mahseer were also introduced by the fisheries department as a conservation measure. Because back in the day, no one really had an idea of what the different species of Mahseer were in the Cauvery. And so the bluefin Mahseer conservation program back then was very successful because they managed to breed them and they brought them to Coorg district as well, where they were released into the Cauvery. So interestingly, what happened with the bluefin species, that's something I didn't mention during the talk, and I think I should mention it now, is after the 2019 flooding, the population of bluefins has drastically reduced. And the catch of humpback mahseer has gone up. So it we're not sure why or what caused this, but it's probably because they're introduced and they're not from that river stretch. That could be one of the reasons. But yeah, the floods washed away all the bluefin mahseer, and now it's mostly the humpback mahseer that you catch in the Coorg Wildlife Society stretch.
Thanks, Neethi, for that. Vibhish has a related question, which is on selling Mahseer fishes in aquariums. He's wondering if people, if Mahseer are being caught and sold in aquariums. He believes he's seen some in advertisements, but he's not sure. Is
I
that true in your experience?
I think there are some aquarium hobbyists who are doing this. wouldn't ever encourage anyone to buy Mahseer and keep them in an aquarium. But yeah, there are people doing this, but they're not like protected under the Wildlife Protection Act. So I guess in that sense, there are only one or two species that come under the Wildlife Protection Act. One is the Kerala one. I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm blanking out, but yeah, it's called Miss Kerala, Denisoni. Yeah, so that's been brought under the Wildlife Protection Act.
Understood. Thanks for that, Neethi, and thank you, Vivesh. We have a question from Arunachala, who first thanks you for the interesting talk, and then asks, in the areas perennially wet closest to the water, sometimes trees don't grow. What do you suggest for this kind of area? And he says that often invasives they take root and grow in those areas.
There are actually species that grow specifically in uh, perennially flooded areas. So these are riparian specific species. So it depends on which area you're talking about and where. You can always find species that are well adapted to flooding and being submerged for extended periods of time. Like, for instance, even the seedlings and saplings that you find in the riparian corridor zone are sometimes submerged for a period of a month or 2 months, and they survive the flooding. So, yeah.
Very interesting. Aruna, please feel free to share a follow-up question if you have any. Moving on, we have a question from Arun, who again compliments you on your excellent presentation. And he wants to understand the status of interaction between groundwater extraction and river systems.
So in Coorg district, there's not much groundwater extraction happening actually. They all have irrigation tanks. So that's mainly where the plantation gets its water from. It's mainly irrigation tanks or ponds. So yeah, here there's no threat of groundwater extraction, so I wouldn't know.
Okay, understood. Samrat has a follow-up question. First of all, he thanks you for your response earlier. And the question is, one sec. Do you have data from earlier on the mortality or growth of Blue-finned Mahseer so that you can assess the restoration of that riparian zone?
The mortality of bluefin Mahseer. I wouldn't say. See, what's happened over the years is, as I mentioned earlier, they also do angling-based conservation in the stretch. So that has been a monitoring tool for the past 40 years or so, and that's how we know that the humpback Mahseer populations declined as well, because the catch rate declined with the angler records that we were going through. So that's how we knew that there was a dip in the population. But otherwise, you can just through the angling community, we're constantly fishing every day in the water. And it's through them that we know what the status is actually. Because otherwise, there's no commercial fishing allowed in these areas. With commercial fishing, you can actually look at catch per unit effort and get data based on that. But here it's mainly anglers who tell us what the status of the population is. Yeah.
Neethi, did you say that the bluefin is actually introduced in the...
Yes, it was introduced back in the 70s or 80s, if I'm not mistaken, and they outcompeted the humpback Mahseer for a while. So
While.
most of our fish, like if you see, we went there to tag humpback Mahseer, but we didn't tag a single humpback Mahseer to tag and track. We mostly tracked the bluefin Mahseer, which also makes sense now. Just listening to anecdotal evidence from the recent floods saying that after the 2019 floods, there's hardly any bluefin Mahseer. So what I suspect happened even with our tagged fish is that they all went further downstream, got washed further downstream because we didn't look beyond 42 kilometers. So maybe they're in KRS Dam. Who knows? We don't know.
I guess, yeah, that's where they're going to end up. But quite interesting. Are they from an ecosystem within India, from close by, or were they introduced from somewhere far away?
From Lonavala, actually, Maharashtra. Maharashtra is where they were actually endangered. So that's why they started. It's a very well planned program. Only problem with that is there are no location specific surveys that were carried out back in the day to be able to say where it can be released and where it shouldn't be released. Yeah, it was done out of good intentions, but it had its own implications. Yeah.
Nice though that the problem seems to have solved itself.
The floods,
The
yes.
floods, yes. I mean, yeah, I
I
guess.
mean, yeah, floods are not great, but yeah.
Yeah. We have thank you from an anonymous attendee. And then I believe, is this a question? I'll just read it out. Given the clear evidence of benefits that you have shown for native species riparian protection, is there any policy measure to protect and restore these as a requirement to push back the area of plantation, especially given flood reduction slash landslide mitigation requirement and wealth held by these stakeholders?
Yes. So there have been talks about this with the forest department, but no one's been able to come up with specific guidelines for this. Simply because you're also talking about taking over someone's livelihood or agroforest zone. So it is a very precarious kind of topic to be discussing because some people would say you need to declare 100 meters of the riverbank as a riparian buffer zone. But it actually depends on the topography of the place. Wherever it's steeper, the riparian corridor is actually way narrower. Where the riverbank is gradual, your riparian corridor is far wider into the land. So it depends on the topography of the place. So nobody's come up with a one solution number for riparian corridors, and I think it has to be done in a specific way where it's location specific, depending on the topography of the place. Yeah. But I think the Kaveri Rejuvenation Report had recommendations, and their recommendation was, of course, 1 kilometer, which is very difficult to implement given that most people live along rivers. Most riverine communities live within 30 meters of the river. So that would mean displacing that many people, which I don't think is possible. They've been there for generations. So, yeah, it's about working with what you have and what can be done with the community at large. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very tricky and I mean, something that requires a lot of deliberation, which is something that, as I was saying, you've done quite well. I wanted to do a quick time check with you, Neethi. We have a couple of questions in the chat that that we can take, but since it's past 5, I also wanted to check with you if you have the time to hang around for, answering a couple more questions.
Sure.
Okay, so I think the first one, I think somebody was asking, and strangely enough, it says that you are asking this. What species of crocodiles are found in Kodagu rivers? And
Marsh crocodiles.
I see somebody also already answered that, but I don't know how it says you're asking that. But anyway. Okay, Raghavendra is asking if you could throw some light on the indigenous knowledge about Mahseer fish from the Jenu Kuruba community.
So this actually is not just from the Jenu Kuruba community, but most riverine communities is that you can only eat them during one particular season. And there's this, this tends to happen. I think it's specific time of the year. It depends on when you consume Mahseer fish and how you cook or consume Mahseer fish. It can cause, this might be, I'm not sure, but this might be linked to their diet and also the riparian species that they're consuming. I mean, fruits of riparian species that they're consuming. It could have something to do with that and plant toxins because it tends to uh, cause nausea and vomiting. So a lot of people stay away from it certain times of the year. Yeah, so this is one thing about the Mahseer, but they catch them, but they're caught during the monsoon. So I'm guessing monsoon is a safe period to eat the Mahseer, but this is all subsistence fishing I'm talking about. Anything more than this is, again, detrimental to the population at large. So the rapids are where people catch them usually when they start migrating upstream. So you'll find a lot of people waiting for the Mahseer migration to happen just so that they can go catch Mahseer fish. Yeah.
Understood. That's quite interesting how, sorry, you go on. You're saying something?
What would have been really great is that even with our study in the Cauvery Wildlife Sanctuary, which is ongoing actually, is we have very few humpback Mahseer specimens that have been tagged and tracked, but we have no monsoon data whatsoever. So that is something we were hoping that we would get out of the spatial ecology study through telemetry, but yeah, we have a long way to go even with that. It requires a lot of patience and I guess just yeah, you just have to be at it all the time. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, Raghavendra, and thank you, Neethi, for that very interesting story. I wonder how they figured out when it's safe to eat the fish.
Trial and error.
Trial and error, I guess, like with all the other foods that we have. We have a question from Vignesh, who's asking if a riparian ecosystem that's been restored or a natural one in lowlands, do these ecosystems have a chance of depositing more sediments and eventually making a change in the natural flowing path of the river?
Absolutely. You see landscapes changing every monsoon. In fact, you see more sand deposition on some years and less sand deposition on other years. So yeah, it depends on the intensity of the monsoon, the flow of the river, and of course your vegetation and how that kind of diverts the river water and deposition.
Thank you. Thanks, Neethi. And thank you, Vignesh. Moving on, we have a question from Akshaya, sorry. They're asking what specific measures are being implemented to tackle industrial effluents and urban sewage discharge into the Cauvery. And they're asking about industrial hubs like Erode and Karur and how is the success of these measures being monitored?
We actually haven't been able to go that far, but just working within Coorg district, there's not much industrial effluence in Coorg per se, but we do have a lot of sewage water that goes in, and of course nutrient pollution as well from it, from fertilizers and pesticides, etc. So with that, we're trying to work with the local government, with the MLAs to get STPs implemented all along the streams and rivers. We even set up a trash barrier 2 years ago to test it out to see if we could manage solid waste flowing through our rivers because a lot of solid waste gets dumped into the river as well, starting all the way from the source of the river. So we figured if we can create that, if we can show them that it works, we can kind of replicate that system all along the Cauvery. But I think it really matters if you can like focus on just small areas and see if it's successful and then take it further. Yeah. But in terms of industrial effluence, I think there are policies and laws in place, but not followed all the time. There are supposed to be treatment plants for effluents. There's supposed to be a ban on discharge of effluents, but not everyone follows these rules. So yeah, every year they have a revised version of the waste management and effluent treatment and management plans, and it keeps changing, but nobody seems to follow them. Even with Coorg, it's been an uphill battle. So I actually work with a civil society group with waste management, and they've been working with the local panchayats for the past 7, 8 years, and we still face the same problems that they've been facing 7 years ago. Except now we don't have. They managed to get the landfills covered up, landfills cleared, and of course make sure that the panchayat is always doing their bit where they collect the waste from everyone's households. But you still have people just like driving up, like, unlicensed waste vendors who collect garbage and then go throw it in the river. There's been many instances where this has happened. So it's all about monitoring and implementation at the end of the day. Implementing some sort of.
I was saying fingers crossed for your collaboration with the government on this. Hope something comes through. I think we are at the end of questions. We have a comment from Aarti who says it would be fabulous to revisit this zone after 10 years. she thanks you for the talk. And
Hi, Aarti. Yeah, thank you.
yeah, and with that, we are at the end of the questions. Thank you so much, everyone, and thanks a lot, Neethi. We know you had a sore throat and were not feeling well, and yet you came here and pushed through. And in a sense, things have come full circle for us. We started this year with a webinar on dam removal and freeing up a river, although that was in the United States. And now we are closing the year with your story of riverine restoration. And we hope that your project in Goa takes off, and also that your story inspires more in our community to take it up in other places in the country.
Thank you so much. And yes, really wonderful to be here. And thanks everyone for making it to this talk. Hope to also hear from you. Even in terms of restoration, we're looking for open for collaborations and just suggestions on how we can make it more robust. So that's something I'm putting out there. We need all hands on deck, especially with riparian restoration and conservation work, river restoration work as well. Thank you.
We'll share Niti's email ID with everyone in case anybody feels like getting in touch. All right. Good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year to all of you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.